Bank manager's arrogance crumbles as CEO mother reveals true power. The air in Grand Union Bank thrummed with the mundane rhythm of midday transactions. At the customer service counter, Aurora Vance, a meticulous 14-year-old, stood, a faint tremor in her carefully practiced composure. She hadn't stolen a single thing. The crisp bills clutched in her hand represented weeks of dedicated chores, excellent grades, and a treasured $950 birthday gift from her grandmother Alara. This was her money, destined for her first checking account, a tangible step toward independence she'd meticulously planned, even sketching potential branch layouts in her notebook. Yet, the bank manager, Eleanor Croft, surveyed the young black girl with an expression that curdled from indifference into outright disdain. "A girl like you with this much cash? I don't think so. You've probably robbed someone." Eleanor's words, sharp and dismissive, sliced through the quiet hum. Aurora's eyes, usually bright with curiosity for architectural blueprints, welled with a stinging humiliation. This was meant to be simple. "Please," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper, "just let me call my mom." Eleanor's smirk widened, a cold satisfaction creeping into her features. "Save it for the police. I'm not falling for your sob story." Without a moment's hesitation, she snatched the phone, dialing with a practiced ease. "Yes, I need officers immediately. I have a young thief attempting to deposit stolen money." Little did Eleanor Croft know, she had just committed the gravest error of her 22-year career. Within the hour, she would discover precisely who Aurora Vance's mother truly was, and with that revelation, Eleanor's carefully constructed world would utterly collapse. What transpired next would not only expose Eleanor's blatant prejudice but also unveil a secret so profound it would reshape everything. Before we delve into the unfolding drama, if you stand against discrimination and injustice, consider hitting that subscribe button, leave a comment detailing where you're watching from, and share this story so others can witness the power of standing up for what's right. It was a brilliant Tuesday afternoon. 14-year-old Aurora Vance practically bounced with anticipation as she stepped off the city bus in Metropolis Central. This wasn't just any day. This was the day she would finally demonstrate to her mother that she possessed the responsibility necessary to manage her own finances. For weeks, Aurora had meticulously prepared for this moment. She'd spent hours meticulously drafting architectural designs, a hobby that underscored her detail-oriented nature, and rehearsed her confident stride through the gleaming glass doors of the bank. This endeavor transcended merely opening a checking account. It was a profound stride toward maturity, a tangible embrace of the adult world. Aurora Vance resided in a world most teenagers could only fantasize about. Her mornings unfolded within a sprawling mansion nestled in the exclusive Emerald Ridge enclave, where impeccably manicured landscapes stretched beyond the horizon. She attended Blackwood Preparatory Institute, an institution where tuition eclipsed most people's annual incomes, and her foremost concern revolved around upholding her stellar 3.9 GPA. Yet, what distinguished Aurora from other privileged youths was her blissful unawareness of her family's colossal wealth. Her mother, Dr. Vivian Albright Vance, had intentionally cultivated an upbringing where Aurora believed they were simply comfortably well off. Aurora commuted to school via public transportation, eschewing chauffeured luxury sedans. She frequented conventional retail outlets, bypassing designer boutiques. Her allowance was diligently earned through completing household chores and consistently achieving high academic marks. This meticulously crafted facade of a normal life was no mere accident. Dr. Vivian Albright Vance had gleaned profound lessons from her own childhood, recognizing that extreme affluence could prove both a benediction and a burden. She vividly recalled the perpetual scrutiny, the relentless photography, and the constant judgment she endured as the heir to the Albright financial dynasty. Consequently, upon Aurora's birth, Vivian made a pivotal decision that would irrevocably shape her daughter's entire worldview. She vowed to instill in Aurora an unwavering understanding of diligent effort and profound humility, long before her daughter ever comprehended the family's immense power. As Aurora entered Grand Union Bank that afternoon, she clutched an envelope containing $950 in birthday funds from her grandmother Alara, a sum representing months of meticulous saving and cherished birthday gifts. Within her backpack, neatly tucked, lay her savings account statements, meticulously documenting $1,350 amassed from allowances, holiday presents, and modest academic rewards over the past 4 years. To Aurora, this constituted a fortune. To her family, it was mere pocket change. The bank's expansive lobby buzzed with the typical afternoon activity. Business professionals in impeccably tailored suits hurried between teller windows, elderly patrons patiently awaited their turn in the VIP section, and the low hum of financial discourse permeated the air. Aurora drew a deep breath, straightened her Blackwood preparatory uniform, and approached the customer service desk with an innate confidence, born from a life where she had never been treated as anything less than highly valued and unequivocally respected. Aurora approached the first available teller window with a radiant smile, clutching her envelope of birthday money and her backpack replete with documents. The nameplate on the counter read, "Brenda Lowell, Customer Service Representative." Brenda looked up from her computer screen, her expression immediately morphing upon seeing the young black girl at her window. Her previously welcoming smile vanished, replaced by an unsettling blend of disgust and suspicion. "What do you want?" Brenda asked icily, her voice dripping with undisguised hostility as she scrutinized Aurora from head to toe, as if she were an unpleasant anomaly. "Hi, good afternoon," Aurora replied cheerfully, striving to maintain her positive demeanor despite the woman's palpable rudeness. "I'd like to open my first checking account, please. I'm truly excited about this." Brenda emitted a harsh, derisive laugh. "Are you serious right now? This is a real bank, not some community center. We don't just hand out accounts to every kid who wanders in here." Aurora's smile began to falter. "I'm 14, and I have all the required documentation. I've been saving for this." 14. Brenda interrupted with a sneer. "And let me guess, you've got cash from selling illicit substances or stealing from people. That's usually how kids like you acquire money around here." Aurora felt as though she had been physically struck. "Kids like me? I don't understand. I attend Blackwood Prep. This is birthday money from my grandmother." "Sure it is," Brenda mocked. "Blackwood Prep, right? You probably stole that uniform too. I know exactly what kind of neighborhood you're from, and it's not the kind that sends kids to fancy schools. I'm calling my manager right now to deal with this situation. She knows precisely how to handle people like you." Brenda picked up her phone and dialed with dramatic flair. "Eleanor, you need to get over to window 3 immediately. I've got one of those urban kids here trying to scam us with suspicious cash." "Yeah, exactly the type we discussed in our staff meeting. She's getting aggressive and making a scene." Within minutes, bank manager Eleanor Croft appeared at the teller window, prepared to seize control of what Brenda had characterized as a typical urban troublemaker scenario. She glanced up from her paperwork, her gaze immediately fixing on Aurora, a young black girl standing in her pristine lobby, and something cold and calculating flickered across her face. The warm, professional smile she typically reserved for customers remained conspicuously absent. "Shouldn't you be in school, young lady?" Eleanor's initial words were not welcoming or helpful, they were instantly accusatory, dripping with suspicion. Aurora blinked, taken aback by the harsh tone, yet maintained her polite demeanor. "Oh, I have permission from my school and my parents. I arranged to leave early specifically for this appointment." She reached into her backpack and retrieved a signed permission slip from her school counselor, but Eleanor barely glanced at the paper. Her attention remained fixed on the envelope Aurora had placed on the counter. When Aurora opened it to display the neatly stacked bills, Eleanor's expression darkened even further. "That's a lot of cash for someone your age. Where did you get this?" The question emerged like an interrogation, devoid of any semblance of customer service. Aurora felt the first flutter of confusion in her stomach. Why was this woman being so hostile? In her sheltered world, the legitimacy of having money had never been questioned before. It's birthday money from my grandmother, and some savings I've been keeping at home. I wanted to deposit it all when I opened my checking account. Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. I find that hard to believe. Grandmothers don't typically give 14-year-olds $950 in cash. The accusation struck Aurora like a physical blow. She had never had her honesty questioned before, never been treated with such overt skepticism. But it's true. She always gives generous birthday gifts. I can show you the antique pocket watch she gave me along with it. Aurora fumbled through her backpack and produced a beautiful, intricate pocket watch that had been a cherished gift, but Eleanor waved it away without even looking. Anyone can acquire a trinket. This could all be fake, Eleanor said dismissively, gesturing at Aurora's carefully prepared documentation. Meanwhile, across town in a gleaming 45-story corporate tower, Dr. Vivian Albright Vance sat in the boardroom of Albright Financial Conglomerate, utterly unaware that her daughter's protected world was beginning to unravel. Vivian was deep in discussion about a major acquisition deal with 6 other executives, a conversation involving the casual movement of millions of dollars. Vivian had spent 15 years meticulously crafting the perfect double life. In business circles, she was renowned as Vivian Albright, the brilliant CEO who had propelled her family's already successful financial empire into unprecedented territories. Financial magazines routinely featured her on their covers. Business schools taught case studies about her innovative strategies. Competitors respected her shrewd decision-making. But in her personal life, she was simply Vivian Vance, Aurora's mom, who drove carpool, attended community project presentations, and worried about normal teenage issues like homework and friendships. She used her married name socially, resided in a beautiful but not ostentatious home, and had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Aurora's childhood remained as normal as humanly possible. This dual identity wasn't merely about privacy, it was about protection. Vivian vividly recalled the immense pressures of growing up as banking royalty, the constant scrutiny, the profound shift in how people treated her once they discovered her family name. She was unyielding in her determination that Aurora would forge her own character, cultivate her own values, and develop her own sense of self-worth before ever learning about the immense power and daunting responsibility that would one day be hers. Back at the bank, Aurora was experiencing a jarring culture shock in real time. She tried once more to show Eleanor her Blackwood Preparatory identification, her birth certificate, and her savings account statements from this very same bank, but Eleanor's hostility only intensified. "Look, sweetie," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with condescension, "girls like you don't just walk around with this kind of money. Honestly, I've been in banking for 22 years, and I know suspicious activity when I see it." The word struck Aurora like a physical blow, "girls like you." She had encountered those words before, in movies, in news stories, but she had never, not once, imagined they would be directed at her. In her carefully constructed bubble, she had been shielded from the harsh realities of racial prejudice, and now, it was hitting her with full, devastating force. "Can you please just help me open an account?" Aurora asked, her voice beginning to waver as confusion and deep hurt seeped in. "I don't understand why you're being so mean to me. I just want to bank here like everyone else." But Eleanor had already made her irrevocable decision. Her entrenched prejudices, her festering resentments, and her newfound, intoxicating sense of power had coalesced into a toxic concoction that blinded her to everything except her own biases. "I don't think so. This money is probably stolen, and I'm not going to be a party to whatever scheme you're running." Desperation began to creep into Aurora's voice. "It's not stolen. Please, if you could just call my mom. She can explain everything. She banks here too. Her name is Vivian Vance." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Nice try. You're not calling anyone until we figure out where you really got this money. For all I know, you're working with adults who sent you in here because they thought a kid would be less suspicious." What Eleanor failed to realize was that if she had simply entered Vivian Vance's name into the bank's computer system, she would have immediately discovered a modest checking account belonging to a local parent, exactly what Aurora claimed. But Eleanor never bothered to check, her mind was already irrevocably made up. As Aurora stood there, feeling smaller and more utterly helpless with each passing minute, other customers in the bank began to take notice. Some looked visibly uncomfortable with Eleanor's overtly hostile treatment of a young girl, but nobody dared to speak up. In that searing moment, Aurora learned a painful, indelible lesson about the world's harsh realities, how people could stand idly by and passively witness injustice unfold without ever intervening. The irony was absolutely staggering. Here stood Aurora Vance, the granddaughter of the Albright financial dynasty, the daughter of one of the most powerful financial executives in the entire country, being treated like a hardened criminal in a bank that her family's immense wealth had helped build and meticulously sustain for over 75 years. But Eleanor Croft had no conceivable way of knowing that. In her distorted mind, she believed she was courageously protecting the bank from a young scammer. In reality, she was poised to utterly destroy her own career by brazenly targeting the wrong family. As the tension in that bank lobby continued to escalate, Aurora felt her meticulously constructed world beginning to crack. For the very first time in her young life, she was experiencing what millions of other young Black Americans regularly faced. The insidious presumption of guilt, the baseless questioning of their legitimacy, the utterly exhausting burden of having to perpetually prove their worth to individuals who had already irrevocably decided they weren't worthy. Little did anyone in that bank realize that in just a few fleeting minutes, everything would irrevocably change. Aurora's mother was about to receive a text message that would transform her from a concerned parent into an avenging force of nature, and Eleanor Croft was about to discover, in the most devastating way imaginable, that sometimes the individuals you most severely underestimate possess far more power than you could ever possibly conceive. Have you ever been unfairly discriminated against because of your appearance? Hit that subscribe button now and share your profound experience with others, as your story could profoundly inspire someone. Aurora stood at that counter, her hands visibly trembling as she pulled out every single piece of identification she had meticulously brought with her. Her school ID from Blackwood Preparatory Institute with her smiling photo, her birth certificate that her mother had meticulously laminated years ago, her savings account statements from this very same bank, clearly showing deposits and withdrawals going back 4 years. Aurora spread these documents across the counter as if she were meticulously laying down cards in a high-stakes game where her freedom was the ultimate wager. "Please," she said, her voice trembling with raw desperation, "look at these. They prove who I am. They prove this is my money." But Eleanor Croft merely looked at those documents with the same expression one might have when contemptuously looking at discarded refuse. She didn't even bother to pick them up to examine them properly. Instead, she shook her head with palpable disgust and uttered the words that would irrevocably seal her own disastrous fate, "These are probably fake too. A 14-year-old with no job doesn't have this much money unless she took it from someone." That's when Aurora finally broke. The crushing weight of the profound injustice, the overwhelming confusion, the paralyzing fear, it all came crashing down on her at once. Tears began streaming uncontrollably down her face as the brutal reality hit her with a visceral force. This woman wasn't going to help her. This woman had already irrevocably decided Aurora was guilty before she had even uttered a single word. "Please," Aurora sobbed, "I just want to call my mom. She can explain everything." But Eleanor's response chillingly revealed the true, abysmal depth of her ingrained racism. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a truly threatening whisper, and uttered something so utterly vile that other nearby customers actually gasped audibly, "Your mom probably sent you here to launder drug money. I've seen this before with people like you. People like you." There it was again. Aurora felt as though she'd been punched squarely in the stomach. At 14 years old, she was learning for the very first time that some people would gaze upon her skin color and immediately, inherently assume the worst possible things about her and her entire family. Aurora was crying harder now, barely able to speak coherently through her choked sobs. "Please, just let me call her. Just one phone call, please." But Eleanor had already irrevocably made up her mind about what came next. Instead of displaying even a shred of human decency, instead of allowing a terrified child to call her parents, Eleanor reached for the phone with a satisfied, triumphant smile on her face. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly enough for half the bank to clearly hear. "This girl is clearly involved in some kind of fraud or theft, and I'm not going to let her manipulate me with crocodile tears." As Eleanor dialed 911, Aurora suddenly realized she might have one fleeting chance to reach her mother. While Eleanor was engrossed in conversation with the police dispatcher, Aurora quietly pulled out her own phone. With trembling fingers, she typed as fast as she possibly could, her tears making it almost impossible to clearly see the screen. "Mom, I'm at Grand Union Bank and the manager called the cops on me. She says I stole the money and won't let me call you. I'm scared." Aurora hit send just as Eleanor finished her call and noticed what she was doing. "Give me that phone." Eleanor snapped, lunging forward to violently grab it. But the message had already been irrevocably sent. It was traveling through cell towers across the sprawling city, heading directly toward a boardroom in a gleaming skyscraper where Aurora's mother was engaged in what she believed was just another routine business meeting. Dr. Vivian Albright Vance sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table on the 42nd floor of the Albright Financial Conglomerate building. Around her sat 6 of the most powerful bank executives in the state, men and women who collectively controlled billions of dollars and made decisions that profoundly affected thousands of lives every single day. They were deep into their quarterly review, meticulously discussing profit margins and market projections, when Vivian's phone buzzed discreetly on the table beside her. She glanced at it and saw Aurora's name prominently displayed on the screen. Vivian had established a special emergency contact protocol for Aurora that would always come through, even during the most important meetings, but Vivian never, not once, expected to actually use it. Aurora was supposed to be safely at Blackwood Preparatory Institute and then proceeding to the bank for what should have been a simple, routine transaction. Vivian picked up her phone and read the urgent message. The room, filled with powerful executives, watched in stunned silence as the most controlled, composed woman they knew underwent a terrifying, visceral transformation. First, a flicker of confusion crossed her face as she struggled to comprehend what she was reading. Then, as the profound meaning of the message sank in, confusion transmuted into pure, unadulterated shock. And finally, shock transformed into something far more dangerous, far more terrifying, pure, bone-chilling rage. The very temperature in that boardroom seemed to inexplicably drop by 10 degrees. Vivian's face became a mask of controlled fury that made everyone around the table unconsciously lean back in their chairs, a primal instinct for self-preservation taking hold. "Gentlemen," Vivian said, her voice so quiet and terrifyingly controlled that it was infinitely more menacing than if she had screamed. "This meeting is over. Someone just made a very costly mistake." She stood up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a sharp crack. The 6 executives, men and women who were accustomed to being the absolute most important people in any given room, suddenly felt incredibly small and profoundly nervous. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" asked Marcus Thorne, the senior vice president who had been presenting the quarterly numbers, his voice laced with trepidation. Vivian was already striding purposefully toward the door, her phone clutched in one hand, her car keys mysteriously appearing in the other. "Someone at Grand Union Bank just arrested my daughter." The silence that followed her pronouncement was deafening, a thick, oppressive blanket that smothered all sound. Everyone in that room knew precisely who Vivian Albright Vance was. They knew intimately about her family's Albright financial dynasty. They knew about her personal net worth, which now stood at a staggering $3.1 billion. And they all suddenly realized, with a horrifying, gut-wrenching clarity, that someone at Grand Union Bank had just made what might very well be the single most expensive, most catastrophic mistake in the entire history of banking. Vivian was speed-dialing numbers as she walked, her heels clicking against the gleaming marble floor like sharp, ominous gunshots. First, her personal attorney, Elijah Hayes, one of the most feared and ruthlessly effective lawyers in the state. Then, her head of security, Commander Gideon Shaw, a former police captain who had been protecting the Albright family for 15 years with unwavering loyalty. And finally, a number that she rarely used but always kept meticulously close at hand, the direct line to Chairman Arthur Penhaligon, the chairman of Grand Union Bank's board of directors. "Frederick," she called to her driver as she stepped into the waiting elevator, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Bring the Rolls-Royce Phantom around. We're going to Grand Union Bank. Now." Back at the bank, Aurora was living through every parent's most terrifying nightmare. 2 police officers had arrived within minutes of Eleanor's frantic call, and they walked into that building with their minds already irrevocably made up about what they were going to find. Officer Sterling Reed, a 15-year veteran of the force, approached the customer service counter where Aurora stood, still openly weeping. His partner, Officer Isabella Cruz, positioned herself nearby. Neither of them seemed remotely interested in hearing Aurora's side of the story. "This girl was trying to deposit what I believe is stolen money," Eleanor explained with obvious, malicious satisfaction. "She has no legitimate explanation for where she got it, and she's been behaving suspiciously since she walked in here." Aurora tried desperately to speak through her tears. "Officers, please, I can explain everything. This is my money. I have all my identification. I just wanted to open a checking account." But Officer Reed barely glanced at her. "We get calls about kids like this all the time," he said dismissively. "Young people involved in theft, illicit substance running, you name it. They always have some fabricated story about legitimate money." Aurora couldn't believe what she was hearing. Kids like this. The very same demeaning phrase Eleanor had used. She was beginning to understand, with a crushing, sickening clarity, that this wasn't just about one racist bank manager. This was about a systemic apparatus that was deliberately designed to work against people who looked like her. "Please," Aurora begged, "just look at my identification. I attend Blackwood Prep. My mother banks here too. You can verify everything." But the officers weren't interested in verification. Officer Cruz was already pulling out her handcuffs with a chilling efficiency. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," she commanded, her voice devoid of emotion. Aurora froze. "Why? Why? I didn't do anything wrong." "You're being detained on suspicion of theft and fraud," Officer Reed explained matter-of-factly. "You can explain your story down at the station." The handcuffs clicked around Aurora's delicate wrists with a harsh, metallic sound that seemed to echo ominously through the entire bank lobby. Other customers immediately stopped what they were doing and stared in wide-eyed horror. A few tentatively pulled out their phones and began recording. An elderly woman near the teller windows shook her head slowly and muttered, her voice barely audible, "This is wrong." But nobody stepped forward to help. Nobody demanded that the officers slow down, exercise caution, and actually investigate before summarily arresting a 14-year-old girl. Aurora was learning another painful, undeniable lesson about how the world truly functioned, that most people, even when they knew something was inherently wrong, would choose to remain safe and silent rather than bravely speak up for justice. As the officers led Aurora toward the door in handcuffs, Eleanor Croft stood behind her counter with a satisfied, triumphant smile on her face. In her mind, she had just valiantly protected her bank from a cunning young criminal. She had no idea, absolutely no idea, that she had actually just irrevocably destroyed her own career and quite possibly her entire future. But across town, a force of nature was heading inexorably in her direction. Dr. Vivian Albright Vance was in the back seat of her Rolls-Royce Phantom, making phone calls that would fundamentally change everything. Her driver, Frederick, was weaving through dense traffic as if he were piloting an ambulance, and in the passenger seat, Vivian's head of security, Commander Gideon Shaw, was already coordinating with the bank's board of directors. If you want to witness Eleanor Croft receive precisely what she so justly deserves, you absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now, because the retribution that's coming is going to be truly, epically satisfying. 28 minutes after Aurora sent that desperate, tearful text message, something truly extraordinary happened outside Grand Union Bank. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom, with tinted windows so dark they looked like polished mirrors, pulled smoothly up to the curb. But this wasn't just any luxury car. The license plate read VDI, A777, standing for Vance Dynastic Investments, and anyone in the discerning banking world would have instantly recognized those formidable initials. The car door opened silently, and Dr. Vivian Albright Vance stepped out onto the sidewalk with an aura of immense power. She wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people's cars. A $12,000 masterpiece of Italian craftsmanship that fit her like a second skin, a suit of armor. Her jewelry was understated but unmistakably expensive, each piece exuding quiet luxury, and she carried herself with the kind of innate confidence that only emanates from generational wealth and absolute, undeniable power. But Vivian wasn't alone. Behind her emerged Elijah Hayes, one of the most feared and respected attorneys in the entire state, a man whose hourly rate surpassed most people's monthly salaries. Next came Commander Gideon Shaw, her head of security and a former police captain, whose formidable presence immediately commanded unwavering respect. And finally, two additional security personnel, whose stoic demeanor suggested they could effortlessly handle any conceivable situation that might arise. Inside the bank, customers who had been going about their normal business suddenly froze and stared. You could literally feel the palpable shift in the atmosphere, like the sudden, ominous change in air pressure before a violent storm. People instinctively moved out of the way as this powerful entourage approached the main entrance. Even the police officers who had just arrested Aurora glanced nervously toward the door, a sudden unease flickering in their eyes. Vivian walked through those glass doors with the commanding presence of someone who inherently owned everything she surveyed. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor in a precise, rhythmic cadence that sounded ominously like a countdown to Judgment Day. Conversations abruptly ceased. Phones were slowly, almost reverently, lowered. Eleanor Croft stood behind her customer service counter, still basking in what she foolishly believed was her moment of triumph. She had successfully removed what she erroneously believed was a young troublemaker from her bank, and she was already mentally anticipating effusive praise from her superiors for her unwavering vigilance. But when Eleanor looked up and saw Vivian approaching, she had absolutely no idea who she was looking at. Despite Vivian's photo appearing in countless financial magazines and prominent business publications for years, Eleanor had never, not once, connected that powerful face to Aurora Vance. The banking world knew Vivian Albright as a formidable CEO, but the photographs were invariably professional headshots in austere business settings, never casual family photos, never candid pictures with her daughter. Vivian walked directly to Eleanor's counter, her dark, piercing eyes fixed immovably on the woman who had dared to harm her child. When she spoke, her voice was so utterly controlled and quiet that it was actually far more terrifying than if she had been screaming in raw fury. "Release my daughter." Immediately, Eleanor looked up at this obviously wealthy, impeccably dressed woman and felt a fleeting moment of confusion. But her ingrained arrogance quickly resurfaced and took over, and she actually had the unmitigated audacity to scoff. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but your daughter is a thief. She was trying to deposit stolen money, and I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The police have already taken her away." Vivian reached into her designer purse and pulled out a business card. But this wasn't just any business card. It was meticulously printed on heavy, luxurious stock paper with elegant gold lettering that caught the ambient light. She placed it deliberately on the counter directly in front of Eleanor with the precise, calculated movements of someone placing a chess piece for checkmate. "I'm Dr. Vivian Albright Vance," she said with deadly, chilling calm. "My family is Vance Dynastic Investments. We don't just bank here, Eleanor. We own here." Eleanor picked up the business card and read it, and for the very first time, a discernible flicker of profound uncertainty crossed her face. The name Albright was legendary, almost mythical, in banking circles. But surely, this couldn't be. "I don't understand," Eleanor stammered, her voice suddenly thin and reedy. "The girl's name is Vance, not Albright." Vivian's smile was colder than a winter wind, devoid of any warmth. Albright is my maiden name. Vance is my married name. And you just arrested the great-granddaughter of the man who founded this bank 75 years ago. The color began perceptibly draining from Eleanor's face as the true, colossal magnitude of her catastrophic mistake began to irrevocably sink in. But Vivian wasn't finished. She was, in fact, just getting started. Vance Dynastic Investments owns 55% of Grand Union Bank, Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger and more commanding with each word, filling the stunned silence of the bank. My family has been the controlling shareholder since 1948. Every promotion you've ever received, every paycheck you've ever cashed, every benefit you've ever enjoyed, it all came from my family's money. By now, a considerable crowd had gathered around the customer service counter. Other bank employees were cautiously emerging from their offices, drawn by the escalating commotion. Customers were pulling out their phones, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid fascination, eager to record what was clearly going to be an epic, unforgettable confrontation. Vivian's attorney, Elijah Hayes, stepped forward at this pivotal point. Ms. Croft, are you seriously suggesting that a child having birthday money constitutes suspicious activity? Are you aware that racial profiling is a federal crime? Before Eleanor could even attempt to respond, the main doors of the bank swung open again, and Chairman Arthur Penhaligon, the chairman of Grand Union Bank's board of directors, practically ran into the building, his usual dignified composure completely abandoned. He was a distinguished man in his 70s who had been diligently managing the Albright family's extensive banking interests for over 28 years. Penhaligon took one horrified look at Vivian and immediately comprehended the grave, irreversible nature of the situation. His face went pale as he approached the rapidly growing crowd around Eleanor's counter. "Vivian," he said, slightly out of breath from his frantic rush to get there. "I came as soon as I received your call. Where is Aurora? Is she hurt?" The sight of the bank's revered chairman rushing in and addressing Vivian by her first name, with such obvious familiarity and concern, sent shock waves through the assembled crowd of onlookers. Eleanor felt her legs suddenly go weak as she realized, with a sickening lurch, that she might be in far more trouble than she had ever possibly imagined. "Charles," Vivian replied, her voice softening ever so slightly when addressing her longtime family friend, "your employee here accused my 14-year-old daughter of theft and money laundering. She refused to let Aurora call me, had refused to verify her identity, and instead, inexplicably called the police to have her arrested." Penhaligon turned to look at Eleanor with an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. "You did what?" Eleanor tried desperately to defend herself, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, a pathetic squeak. "Sir, I was just following protocol for suspicious activity. The girl had a lot of cash and no valid explanation." "No valid explanation?" Vivian interrupted, her voice rising for the first time, a potent undercurrent of fury now evident. "She told you it was birthday money from her grandmother. She showed you her identification, her school records, her savings account statements from this very bank. What more explanation did you conceivably need?" Penhaligon was already on his phone, furiously calling for security footage to be reviewed immediately. Within minutes, they were all watching the bank's cameras on a large monitor that had been hastily brought out from the security office. The footage was utterly damning. It showed Aurora entering the bank, politely approaching Eleanor's counter with a hopeful smile, and respectfully presenting her documents. It then showed Eleanor immediately becoming hostile, inexplicably refusing to examine Aurora's identification, and treating her with blatant, undeniable contempt from the very first moment. But more importantly, the footage then showed other interactions Eleanor had had over the past few months. Case after chilling case of Eleanor giving undue special scrutiny to minority customers, inexplicably asking for additional documentation that she did not require from white customers, and consistently treating people of color with obvious suspicion and ingrained hostility. "My God," Penhaligon whispered, his voice filled with a profound sense of shame, as he watched the irrefutable evidence of systematic discrimination playing out vividly on the screen. "Eleanor," how long has this been going on?" But Eleanor couldn't answer. She was staring at the monitor in wide-eyed horror, watching her entire career implode in agonizing real time. Every racist assumption, every biased decision, every sickening moment of discrimination was there, laid bare for everyone to see. Vivian turned to Penhaligon with steel in her voice, unwavering resolve in her gaze. "Arthur, I want to know how many other customers have been treated this way. I want a full, exhaustive investigation into this woman's conduct, and I want it started immediately." Penhaligon nodded grimly, his face etched with concern. "It will be done, Vivian. I cannot begin to adequately apologize for what has happened here today. This is absolutely inexcusable." But Vivian wasn't looking for apologies. She was looking for justice. "Where is my daughter now?" "She's been taken to the juvenile detention center for processing," Penhaligon replied, already pulling out his phone. "But I can have her released immediately. I'll call the chief of police personally." As Penhaligon made his urgent calls, Vivian turned back to Eleanor, who was now visibly shaking uncontrollably behind her counter, her bravado completely evaporated. The irony of the situation was absolutely devastating. Eleanor had spent 22 years diligently working her way up in a bank that was ultimately owned by the very family she had just viciously attacked. "You know what the most tragic part of this is, Eleanor?" Vivian said quietly, her voice laced with a profound sadness. "My daughter has never experienced racism before today. She's lived a sheltered life, meticulously protected from people like you. She walked into this bank with complete, innocent trust in the system, genuinely believing that if she was polite and honest, she would be treated fairly." Eleanor tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, but no words came out. "Today, you stole her innocence," Vivian continued, her voice gaining a quiet power. "You taught a 14-year-old girl that some people will hate her for the color of her skin, no matter how educated she is, no matter how polite she is, no matter how legitimate her business is. That's something she can never unlearn." The security guards who had been called to escort Eleanor from the building were the very same ones who had stood by passively and watched Aurora being handcuffed earlier. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "Miss Croft," Penhaligon said officially, his voice stern and unwavering. "Your employment with Grand Union Bank is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you are permanently banned from all bank properties." As Eleanor was led away in utter disgrace, Vivian turned to address the stunned crowd of customers and employees who had witnessed the entire, dramatic confrontation. "Let this be a profound lesson to everyone here," she said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast bank lobby. "Racism isn't just morally wrong, it's bad business. It's expensive, and in this specific case, it just cost someone their entire career." But the story wasn't over yet. Vivian still had to get to her daughter, who was sitting in a detention center, undoubtedly terrified and utterly confused about how her simple trip to the bank had devolved into such a horrific nightmare. What would you have done if you were in Vivian's shoes, and your daughter was wrongly arrested? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to click that subscribe button for more stories like this. The aftermath of Eleanor's firing was swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. Within 30 minutes of Chairman Penhaligon's stark announcement, security guards were already systematically clearing out Eleanor's office. 22 years of accumulated personal items, family photos, cherished awards, framed certificates of achievement, were unceremoniously dumped into plain cardboard boxes. Her access cards were instantly revoked, her computer password was changed without delay, and her name was promptly stripped from the employee directory. But this public humiliation was merely the beginning. As word spread like wildfire through the bank, employees who had worked with Eleanor for years began to recall incidents they had previously overlooked or dismissed. The way she would make thinly veiled, disparaging jokes about certain customers, how she always seemed to inexplicably require extra documentation from people of color, the subtle but undeniably consistent pattern of ingrained discrimination that everyone had noticed but no one had been brave enough to report. Within 2 hours, Eleanor's professional reputation was in utter ruins. The banking industry is surprisingly small and interconnected, and news travels with astonishing speed through professional networks. By the end of that first day, Eleanor's termination and the explicit reasons behind it had spread like a contagion to banks across the entire state. By the end of the week, financial institutions nationwide knew precisely what Eleanor Croft had done to Aurora Vance. The story became a chilling cautionary tale, whispered in hushed tones at banking conferences and during professional development seminars. Eleanor's name became synonymous with everything that was profoundly wrong with institutional racism in financial services. Her LinkedIn profile, once proudly displaying 2 decades of steady advancement through various prestigious positions, now showed a glaring, inexplicable gap that every potential employer would immediately understand without a single word of explanation. But Eleanor's immediate punishment was just the beginning of the far-reaching systemic changes that Aurora's case would ultimately bring about. The police officers who had arrested Aurora without conducting any real, meaningful investigation suddenly found themselves under the most intense scrutiny of their careers. Officer Sterling Reed, a 15-year veteran who had long prided himself on his quick response times and decisive action, discovered, to his chagrin, that speed and decisiveness meant absolutely nothing without fairness and a thorough, impartial investigation. His body camera footage was reviewed frame by painstaking frame, chillingly revealing a consistent pattern of baseless assumptions and ingrained biases that his supervisors could no longer possibly ignore. Officer Isabella Cruz, who had been the one to actually place the cold, hard handcuffs on Aurora, found herself facing a barrage of uncomfortable questions about why she had never asked to see the documents Aurora kept desperately trying to show them, why she had automatically believed Eleanor's unsubstantiated accusations without any verification, and why she had treated a terrified, weeping 14-year-old like a hardened criminal. Both officers were summarily suspended pending a full, exhaustive internal affairs investigation that would meticulously examine not just this egregious incident but every single arrest they had made involving minority suspects over the past 5 years. Their case files were reviewed for discernible patterns of racial bias, their reports were scrutinized for any language that might subtly indicate prejudice, and their training records were carefully examined to determine if they had missed crucial education about implicit bias and effective community policing strategies. The ongoing investigation revealed disturbing, deeply entrenched patterns. Officer Reed had arrested black suspects at a rate nearly 3 times higher than his white colleagues, despite working in the very same neighborhoods. Officer Cruz had utilized force against minority suspects significantly more often than against white suspects in demonstrably similar situations. The collected data painted a stark, undeniable picture of systemic bias that could no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. Do you think Eleanor and the officers' punishment was sufficient, or should there have been even more severe consequences for what they did to Aurora? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because the final chapter of this story is going to show you the profound, long-term impact of what happened in that bank on that fateful day. The police department's handling of Aurora's case became an immediate, widely publicized case study in what not to do when responding to calls involving minors and people of color. They had failed miserably to verify basic facts, refused to listen to Aurora's clear explanation, and immediately, inexplicably sided with an adult's word over a child's, simply because of ingrained racial stereotypes and prejudiced assumptions about economic class. The public outrage was swift, overwhelming, and sustained. Community groups that had been tirelessly complaining about police bias for years suddenly had a perfect, irrefutable example of how the system catastrophically failed young people of color. The poignant fact that Aurora came from an affluent family only served to highlight how much worse the treatment must inevitably be for children without powerful, influential advocates. Within weeks, the police department was compelled to implement sweeping, transformative reforms. New protocols strictly required officers to conduct thorough, unbiased investigations before making arrests, especially when children were involved. Officers were mandated to complete enhanced bias training every 6 months, a comprehensive curriculum designed to dismantle implicit prejudices. Body camera footage would be randomly reviewed for any discernible signs of discriminatory behavior. And most importantly, a civilian oversight board was established with the explicit authority to investigate complaints of racial profiling, ensuring accountability. Meanwhile, Chairman Arthur Penhaligon was working grueling 20-hour days to repair the extensive damage to Grand Union Bank's reputation and implement comprehensive changes that would prevent similar incidents from ever happening again. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Albright family's continued ownership of the bank hinged entirely on his ability to prove that this was an isolated incident, an anomaly, and not at all representative of the institution's core values. The changes were comprehensive and immediate. Every single employee, from part-time tellers to senior executives, was required to complete 35 hours of intensive bias training within 65 days. The training wasn't just online modules that people could mindlessly click through, it included immersive role-playing exercises, realistic real-world scenarios, and candid, face-to-face discussions about unconscious bias and the paramount importance of customer service excellence. New protocols were meticulously established specifically for serving minor customers. Young people would no longer be automatically viewed with suspicion simply because of their age. Staff were rigorously trained to recognize that teenagers from diverse economic backgrounds might have perfectly legitimate reasons for carrying cash or making substantial deposits. Most importantly, the bank established an ironclad rule that no customer under 18 could be refused service or reported to authorities without the explicit approval of at least 2 managers and verifiable documentation of specific policy violations. But the most profound changes were quietly unfolding in the Albright family's private conversations. The drive home from the juvenile detention center was the longest 25 minutes of both Aurora's and Vivian's lives. Aurora stared blankly out the window, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by, desperately trying to process how her safe, predictable world had suddenly become so complicated, so frightening, so unjust. "Mom," Aurora finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, choked with lingering trauma. "Why did that woman hate me so much? I've never even met her before today. I was polite. I had all my documents. I didn't do anything wrong." Vivian's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel as she struggled desperately to find the right words to explain something that she herself, even now, still found utterly incomprehensible. How do you tell a 14-year-old that some people will hate her for something as arbitrary as the color of her skin? "Baby," Vivian said, pulling the Rolls-Royce Phantom over to the side of the road so she could give this momentous conversation the complete attention it so deeply deserved. "What happened to you today wasn't about anything you did or didn't do. That woman made assumptions about you based on the color of your skin, and that's called racism. It's ugly, and it's profoundly wrong, but it's something that, unfortunately, exists in this world." Aurora turned to look at her mother, confusion and deep hurt etched all over her face. "But we have money. We live in a nice house. I go to a good school. Doesn't that matter?" This was the exact moment Vivian had been dreading for 15 years. She had spent Aurora's entire life trying to meticulously create a protective bubble where her daughter could grow up free from the harsh, brutal realities of prejudice and discrimination. She had painstakingly crafted a life where Aurora would be judged solely by her character and her achievements, rather than her race or her family wealth. But now, that carefully constructed bubble had been irrevocably shattered, and Vivian realized, with a sharp pang of regret, that her very protection might have actually left Aurora more vulnerable than she could ever have imagined. "Sweetheart," Vivian said, taking a deep, fortifying breath. "I need to tell you something truly important about our family. We don't just have money. We have a lot of money. More than most people could ever possibly imagine." Over the next 2 intense hours, sitting in that Rolls-Royce Phantom on the side of the road, Vivian explained everything: the Albright financial dynasty that had been started by her great-grandfather Alastair in the 1940s, the family's current net worth of $3.1 billion, the irrefutable fact that they owned controlling interest not just in Grand Union Bank but in dozens of other prominent financial institutions across the entire country. Aurora learned that her comfortable middle-class life had actually been meticulously constructed to cunningly conceal the profound reality of her family's immense, sprawling wealth and power. The modest house was, in truth, just one of 8 properties the family owned. The public school events Vivian attended were carefully balanced by private board meetings where she made decisions profoundly affecting thousands of employees and millions of customers. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aurora asked, feeling utterly overwhelmed by these stunning revelations and a slight, unsettling sense of betrayal by the elaborate deception. Vivian reached over and gently took her daughter's hands, squeezing them reassuringly. "Because I wanted you to develop your own character first. I wanted you to understand the fundamental value of hard work, genuine kindness, and profound humility before you learned about the immense responsibility that inherently comes with our family's position. I thought I was protecting you from the immense pressures and unrealistic expectations that accompany extreme wealth. But I realize now that I may have left you unprepared for the real world." Aurora was quiet for a long, reflective moment, staring down at their joined hands as she processed every single thing she had just learned. "So, we could have stopped what happened today." "Yes," Vivian said firmly, her voice resolute. "And we did stop it. But more importantly, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids who don't have our advantages." That profound conversation in the Rolls-Royce Phantom marked the definitive beginning of Aurora's transformation from a sheltered teenager into a passionate young activist with a clear, unwavering sense of purpose. She spent the next several weeks voraciously reading everything she could about civil rights, economic justice, and the often dark history of discrimination in financial services. She learned about redlining, predatory lending, and the countless insidious ways that banking institutions had historically been used to perpetuate racial inequality. But Aurora also learned about the incredible power of advocacy and the paramount importance of using one's privilege to bravely fight for others. Within a month of her traumatic arrest, the Albright Family Foundation announced a major, groundbreaking new initiative designed to comprehensively educate young people about their financial rights and provide vital resources for families who face discrimination in banking. The program, aptly named Financial Justice for All, was comprehensive and extraordinarily ambitious. It included engaging educational workshops for teenagers about their fundamental rights when opening accounts or conducting banking business. It provided invaluable legal resources for families who faced discrimination. It funded dedicated community organizations that tirelessly worked to promote financial literacy in underserved communities. And it established a confidential hotline that young people could call if they experienced treatment similar to what Aurora had so unfairly faced. Aurora became the compelling face of the campaign, bravely sharing her deeply personal story at schools, community centers, and youth organizations across the state. Her message was simple but profoundly powerful: every young person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect when conducting legitimate business, regardless of their race, economic background, or age. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of young people came forward with their own heart-wrenching stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. Many had simply accepted poor service or suspicious treatment as normal, not realizing that they possessed fundamental rights and had powerful advocates who would fiercely fight for them. Grand Union Bank, meanwhile, was diligently implementing changes that would become a widely emulated model for financial institutions across the entire country. The new youth-friendly policies extended far beyond simple bias training. The bank completely redesigned its customer service approach specifically for minor clients, consciously recognizing that young people might require additional guidance and patience when learning to navigate complex financial systems. Special youth specialists were specifically hired and meticulously trained to work exclusively with customers under 18. These specialists inherently understood that teenagers might have questions that seemed basic to adults, that they might be nervous about their very first banking experiences, and that they deserved the exact same level of professional, respectful service as any adult customer. The bank also created comprehensive educational materials specifically designed for teenagers who were opening their first accounts. These materials lucidly explained banking terminology, outlined customer rights, and provided clear, concise guidelines about what documents were precisely needed for different types of transactions. Most importantly, they established clear, non-negotiable protocols to explicitly prevent any customer from being treated with suspicion or hostility based on their appearance or assumed economic status. But perhaps the single most powerful moment in this entire story came exactly 1 week after Eleanor's termination, when Vivian returned to Grand Union Bank to address the remaining staff. She stood in the main lobby, the very spot where her daughter had been so unjustly humiliated and arrested, wearing the same commanding presence that had so effectively dismantled Eleanor's career. The entire staff was assembled, tellers, managers, security guards, and administrative personnel. They stood in nervous, reverent silence as Vivian prepared to speak, acutely aware that their jobs and the bank's very future might well depend on what she said next. "My family built wealth in this country despite people like Eleanor trying to stop us," Vivian began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the immense building. "My great-grandfather Alastair started with nothing but unwavering determination and an unshakable belief that financial services should be equally available to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the neighborhood they came from." She paused to look slowly around the room, making intense eye contact with individual employees as she continued. "He faced discrimination that was legal and openly practiced in his time. Banks refused to serve him. Loan officers told him to his face that they didn't do business with people like him. But he didn't give up. He worked twice as hard, saved every single penny, and eventually started his own bank that would serve everyone fairly." Vivian's voice grew stronger, more resonant, as she warmed to her powerful theme. "3 generations later, my daughter walked into this bank, a bank that her great-great-grandfather's money helped build. And was treated like a criminal by someone who was paid with my family's money. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic." The room was absolutely silent, held captive, as Vivian continued. "Aurora will learn from this experience that respect isn't given, it's demanded. And we have the power to demand it. But more importantly, she'll learn that having power means using it to protect people who don't have power." Vivian's speech was recorded by local news crews and instantly posted online, where it quickly went viral. The video was shared millions of times, becoming a powerful rallying cry for economic empowerment and civil rights. But for Vivian, it wasn't about fleeting fame or public recognition, it was about ensuring that no other child would ever go through what Aurora had so painfully experienced. The speech also served as a clear, unmistakable warning to anyone in the financial services industry who might be tempted to engage in discriminatory practices. The message was unmistakable: the Albright family was watching. They possessed the formidable resources to fight back, and they were utterly unafraid to use their immense power to demand justice. For months later, Aurora returned to Grand Union Bank to finally open that checking account she had originally come for. But this time, she wasn't just a sheltered 14-year-old trying to prove her independence. She was a poised young woman who understood both her privilege and her profound responsibility, who had learned hard lessons about the world's pervasive injustices but had also discovered her own inherent power to fiercely fight against them. The staff treated her with the utmost respect and professionalism, of course, but Aurora made it unequivocally clear that she expected the same respectful treatment for every young customer who walked through those doors. She had learned that having power means using it to protect people who don't have the same advantages. The account opening process that should have taken 10 minutes the first time was completed in less than 4 minutes this time. Aurora received a welcome packet specifically designed for young customers, a personal introduction to her dedicated youth specialist, and a clear explanation of all the services available to her. As for Eleanor Croft, her downfall was complete and utterly irreversible. The banking industry's informal, yet highly effective, networks ensured that her damning story followed her wherever she tried to find new employment. Financial services companies, insurance firms, and related businesses all knew precisely what she had done and why she had been summarily fired. Eleanor discovered, to her bitter dismay, that reputation in the professional world is absolutely everything, and once it's destroyed, it's almost impossible to rebuild. She found herself working a disheartening series of low-paying retail jobs, each one a painful, constant reminder of the once promising career she had foolishly thrown away through her own ingrained prejudice and virulent hatred. But perhaps the most fitting, ironic part of Eleanor's punishment was that she was forced to watch from afar as the very banking industry she'd been ignominiously expelled from underwent the precise changes that might have saved her career if she had only chosen to embrace them earlier. Every news story about comprehensive bias training, every article about inclusive customer service, every recognition that Grand Union Bank received for its progressive, pioneering policies, was a stark reminder of what she could have been a part of if she had chosen differently. And Eleanor's chance of ever working in banking again was, of course, exactly zero. But her story had become a powerful, indelible teaching tool, utilized extensively in bias training programs across the country to vividly illustrate the devastating, real-world consequences of discrimination and ingrained prejudice. If you found this story impactful, like, subscribe, and share with others so they too can learn from this powerful narrative. See you in our next story.